Hey, Batu students, Mr. Yantz. Let's continue on in day 3 of notes for animal reproduction. So we're going to kind of put a special emphasis on human reproduction today. So we're going to go into quite a bit of detail, and we'll be on that for probably all this week. So before I get into that, let's talk a little bit about gamete production and delivery. Gametes can be egg or sperm. That's just a general term of biology for the sex cells, okay? And the bottom line is, to reproduce, we got to produce gametes. And in most species, we have this term called gonads, which can be the male or the female. It just means that's the ones that produce the sex cells, okay? Some very simple systems, they don't have gonads, but gametes form from undifferentiated tissue. But what I want to talk about with human reproduction is obviously a more elaborate system. We have accessory tubes and glands, and not only is the reproductive system primary goal is to produce the sperm and the egg. That's the primary purpose. There's also glands and accessory things that help nourish, protect the gametes, involved with developing of the embryo to adulthood. There's lots of things involved with that. So that's pretty much what we're going to kind of get into for the next week or so, is how do we do that in human systems? And gamete production is an issue in a lot of species, not just us. You can have a problem with the sperm, you can have a problem with the eggs, and fertility problems is a big thing for lots of people. So we'll talk a little bit about that down the road as well. Okay, so we're going to have a primary focus on just the human system. I'll go over the female system and then the male. I will tell you this, and that's why you'll probably notice from the coloring sheets that it's mainly focusing on the female system, and the reason for that is because they're so more complex of a system in a female than a male. Male just has to produce a sperm. Female system has to not only produce the egg, then it has to have all these elaborate systems for developing the fetus, carrying the fetus, giving birth to the fetus. I'm going to tell you right up front, guys, the females have a lot more to put up with and a lot more things to deal with the reproductive system than we would ever think of dealing with. So just kind of keep that in mind as we kind of go through this. And yes, I feel like you guys are juniors and seniors. I think we can handle this topic, so we're going to go into pretty much a lot of detail. So just kind of be prepared for that as we kind of go in there. Okay, so the female reproductive system, I'll show you a quick video here in just a second. Mainly the reproductive structures include the clitoris and 2 sets of labia. The internal organs are a pair of gonads, which we call the ovaries, and the fallopian tubes that carry the gamete and house the embryo and fetus. So I just want to kind of show you a quick video to kind of introduce that, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so this is an introduction to female reproductive anatomy. So the idea of this tutorial is not to go into huge amounts of detail, but to introduce you to some of the basic elements of the female reproductive tract. So what we're looking at here is a lateral view of the pelvic viscera. So anteriorly we've got the bladder, behind that we've got the female reproductive system, and then behind that we've got the rectum and the anal canal. So you can see the location of this reproductive system in relation to the bladder and the digestive system behind it. So the main parts that I'm going to talk about are the ovaries, which are the primary female sex organ, and then you've got the fallopian tubes, or the uterine tubes as they're also known, which connect to the uterus, which is this muscular sac, which is where the embryo develops into a fetus, which develops into a baby. And then you've got the vagina, which opens up in the perineum. So if I just rotate the model around, you can have a look from the anterior aspect. So you've got
I do want to kind of stop it right there for just a second. I want you to take note that the uterus sits right on top of the bladder. So, women, when they're 8, 9 months pregnant, 7 months pregnant, they go to the bathroom a lot. So that's something we have to kind of keep in mind, guys. Like when you're on a road trip and you have a pregnant wife someday, they're going to go to the bathroom a lot. Just kind of kind of understand why, because they literally, as that baby gets to be 8-9 pounds, think about how that's going to compress down on that bladder and make them have to go to the bathroom a lot. They just can't hold urine for very long.
The uterus, which we're looking at here, you can see the superior portion of the uterus, which is known as the fundus. You've got the fallopian tubes, and you've got the ovaries on either side. So I've just switched to this model here of an isolated view of the female anatomy. So you can see these white oval shaped structures, which are the ovaries, and as I mentioned before, they're the primary sex organs of the female. So they are responsible for producing the female sex cells, or the egg, or the ovum as it's known. And this ovum is released monthly, and the process of releasing the ovum from the ovary is known as ovulation. So the ovaries are actually suspended in the peritoneal cavity by several ligaments, and I won't talk about these here, but it's important to know that the ovaries are intraperitoneal and they release the egg into the peritoneal cavity. And what happens is that the fallopian tube have these finger-like projections distally, which are known as fimbriae. So you can see these little finger projections coming off the distal end of these tubes, which are known as the uterine tubes. And these fimbriae are responsible for wafting the egg that's released from the ovary into the tube. So the uterine tube has 4 parts. It's got an infundibulum, an ampulla, an isthmus, and an intrauterine part. So,
okay, and he's going in a little more detail than maybe we'll go into, but just kind of want to give you a little bit of a sense of where things are located. Now, he's got a lot of terms in there. We'll go over some, but the big thing is, how do we release those ovums, those eggs? They're on a monthly cycle. They take turns which ovary releases them. Where does fertilization take place? That's kind of what I want to kind of go through as we go through notes here a little bit and get into this in more detail as we go. So here we go. So let's kind of look at this. Starting with the ovaries. So the ovaries, as you saw on the video, lie in the abdominal cavity. They contain many follicles, which consists of partially developed eggs, and they're called oocytes, and they're surrounded by support cells. So they sit in there. So a woman's going to have the total number of follicles she's going to have for her lifetime or her reproductive years, and there is a set number. So there's only so many of these are going to be released in a woman's lifetime. And then when that's done, menopause sets in and reproduction's done. So, when they say women have a kind of a time clock or their biological clock's running out for having babies, there's a lot of truth to that. There is a set number of these and that's it. All right. Once a month, an oocyte develops into an ovum. So these partially developed eggs, what they're going to develop into an ovum, and that process is called oogenesis, which means the birth of an ovum. Okay. Now understand that is cyclic. Sometimes more than one develops, and we can get multiple births. And sometimes they go in there and harvest these, put them in the freezer, and bring them out and implant them. So there's lots of stuff involved with this process called oogenesis. All right, and this is just a color sheet you guys are working on. It shows you the ovaries up here, shows you the fallopian tubes, and then shows you this the uterus, which is pretty amazing. I'll show you a real picture of it later, but it's pretty crazy that this small structure can develop into a housing for an 8-9 pound baby. So pretty crazy stuff. Here's another view. These fallopian tubes are quite fascinating. So when that ovum is released, there's muscle contractions. There's these fimbria that kind of produce a wave that pushes that ovum through the fallopian tubes. And it actually gets fertilized in fallopian tubes, but you don't want to implant there, obviously. You want to implant in the uterus. And some women have what they call tubal pregnancy, where that gets fertilized and implants too soon, and obviously a baby cannot develop in there, and they have to get that out. But there's a lot of tricky parts to this release, the timing, where it gets fertilized, and how high it implants the uterus. We'll talk all about that later on as we get into more details with pregnancy and things like that. So just some other views. Very complex system, a lot more complex than the male, as you will see. There's the corpus luteum. We'll talk about that. There's all these little follicles that will develop into ovums eventually. And when they do, once a month, they get released into that tube, and they travel through, get fertilized, and implant in this muscular thing called the uterus. All right. Ovulation is a term we use that describes expelling the egg cell from the follicle. And that's controlled by hormones. Okay. So the cells which produce estradiol prior to ovulation, that's got what kind of triggers that. The remaining follicular tissue grows within the ovary, forming a mass called the corpus luteum. Okay. And that's where it gets a little bit complex. The corpus luteum secretes estradiol and progesterone that helps maintain pregnancy. So here's the deal. And I'll get into this later too, but there's a lot of shifting of hormones, and I'll tell you that because there's a certain amount of hormones that produces ovulation. There's a different set of hormones that kicks in when a woman becomes pregnant and maintains the pregnancy. There's another set of hormones that are released during childbirth. A set of hormones during the menstrual cycle. So I think it's really important we understand that. And yes, guys, it is true, not something that's just said, that you have to understand that women's emotions and their hormones are all over the place during some of these situations where we're releasing or we're pregnant, or it's a roller coaster for them. So I think we have to be understanding of that and be a little bit more sympathetic sometimes more than we are. Okay. If the egg is not fertilized, the corpus luteum degenerates. So the body is actually saying to itself, this has a potential of becoming pregnant. We're going to get ready, because the uterus and everything has to get ready. So if it does get fertilized, it's good to go. So every time during the menstrual cycle that ovum is released, the body has to think ahead and say, I got to get ready just in case I have a pregnancy. If it doesn't get fertilized, then that's going to degenerate and the lining is going to get shed and we're going to get some bleeding, and that's the menstrual cycle, which we will talk about a little bit later, probably next part of notes. Okay. This is kind of what's interesting. I love this graph. This shows you the follicular number that women are born with, and then it just keeps going down. There's puberty. This is when they're most fertile. These are some astronomical number. This is when fertility declines. And when it gets to a certain point, menopause sets in. So these follicular numbers are only going to go down as a woman gets older, and that's why they talk about that biological clock. Okay. So last thing, then we'll be done with notes for today. Women are born with 1 to 2 million eggs. Think about that. They're born with 1 to 2 million eggs. 11,000 a month die prior to puberty. We don't know why, but they have a lot to start with. There's about 300,000 that are left after puberty, and a woman will release about 300 to 400 of those during their reproductive lifetime, which is an average of about 30 years. And women lose around 1,000 eggs a month. And any remaining eggs left over, usually about 1,000, they just kind of die off as they go through menopause. So that's why a lot of times in fertility clinics, they'll harvest these and store them so that they can implant them when they need to. So there's a lot of them, but a lot of them die and a lot of them just never get released. And you can see the astronomical numbers there. All right, so that's a good place to start. Just kind of want to kind of get a little bit of an introduction. We'll talk more about that system because it's so complex tomorrow and maybe the next day. All right, Hey, have a great day. And as always, if you have questions, shoot me an email. We'll talk to you later. See ya. Bye.